Hey guys, it's Raz. All right, so again, this is going to be mostly a review of things we've done in class because we're not going to spend a ton of time, but just in case you want to review, talk about fishing. So first of all, we talked about the fact that our human population is rapidly increasing, right? And we need protein. And one of the most popular ways around the world to get protein is through fish, right? And these are four of the most popular ones that we see. I'm sure you've eaten them all at some point in your life, unless you don't like fish, but they're popular. And truthfully, everything I learned about the ocean came from Finding Nemo. If you haven't watched the movie, go rewatch it or watch it. I'm not going to show you guys this, but this is that scene where they've got a whole bunch of fish in that net, right? And they're starting to be pulled up, and Dory and Nemo convince them all to swim down, and they break the net and all that, which we'll talk about in a second, just referencing it for now. So there's several different ways that we fish commercially, right? And this isn't like the little person going out with their fishing pole. Big kind of system ways of catching fish. So the first way, or one of the ways we can do this, is what's called a bottom trawl and dredging. So we literally take nets that are kind of weighted down, we drag them along the ocean floor, and we're going to catch our bottom dwelling stuff. Flounder, fluke, shrimp, some fish that kind of like to live at the bottom, shellfish, things like that. The concern with this is that as you drag that, you're also destroying the habitat, right? You're kicking up lots of dust and dirt, you're uprooting plant life that may be there. It's pretty harmful to that bottom ecosystem. Think of it as kind of like mountaintop removal for mining, but underwater. Another thing we can do is what's called a mid-water trawl, and that's that first picture up there, where again, big net, it gets dragged behind a boat through kind of the open ocean, the center there, and we're catching fish that way. You can catch whole schools of fish this way, usually things that, again, are going to kind of live in like that inner kind of middle area. Pretty effective. I'll talk about that one in a second, the negatives. We also have this purse seining. That's the bottom picture down there, which basically is there's a big kind of circle net that they drop. There's like buoys that hold it up around the side, and they encircle that school of fish. They kind of like drag it around, close the bottom, pull it up. Okay. There's also something called gill nets. So those are basically a big, like a volleyball net, a big wall of netting, and fish kind of get entangled to it as it moves around, and we pull them up because they get stuck. And then long lining is actually one of the worst types, but it basically is one big, huge fishing line, like one line that kind of comes off the boat, and it'll have lots and lots and lots of little hooks. These long lines are obviously the hooks are baited, but they can be as long as 50 miles long. So think about how many hooks that's putting in, and think about how many fish are getting pulled out of the ocean, with one line. And sometimes there's several lines of these lines coming off of one vessel. Okay. So if you go back to Finding Nemo, if you look at that fishing, ask yourself the question, pause if you need to, or if you remember from class, what type of fishing were they showing there? That was midwater trawling. Kind of pulled along and they got scooped up. Now, Dory and Nemo, or maybe it's Marlin, I don't remember, it's Dory and Marlin, sorry. They are what we call bycatch. They were fish that were caught that were not the intended targets of that fishing expedition, right? These guys were going for tuna, I think it was. They got these other things. We see a lot of species get kind of caught up in these nets. Some of the more popular ones, right? Dolphins, sharks, turtles, lots of different kinds of fish. And ultimately, if it's something that you're not intending to catch, often it's thrown back. But a lot of times the stress just of being caught or being out of the water, those fish don't make it, or they get injured from the nets or the lines. They don't make it. So there's been a big push to try to reduce bycatch. So how can we fish in a way that's more efficient, that we're catching what we want, but not what we don't want? And tuna was really the first sort of one that kind of came out as big. We had this dolphin safe tuna. And that kind of came about in the early 90s. Dolphins were kind of becoming threatened. People like dolphins. They're cute, right? So they kind of cared a little bit. And we ended up creating the Dolphin Protection Consumer Information Act, which is part of the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act. And basically what it did is it labeled things as dolphin safe. And it made sure people understood that if your tuna that you're buying doesn't have a dolphin safe label on it, you probably killed some dolphins along the way as part of that fishing. Oops, sorry. There we go. So what's interesting about this, and I thought this was pretty, when I first learned about this, kind of like mind-boggling. So in 2008, Mexico actually launched a case against the United States saying that labeling discriminated against their tuna, which was not caught using dolphin-safe methods. So they're basically like, hey, we don't do this, we don't label it, and no one's buying our stuff, and that's not fair. They were actually ruled in favor of because they called it a technical barrier to trade. And we actually had sanctions placed on us as a country for impeding that trade. Okay. Which, yeah. Yeah. So the other thing, so kind of along with that, in 2017, the U.S. kind of trying to come up with a way to still be bycatch safe and not break that other rule, they started enforcing a new import rule. So what they did is they required all fisheries that are exporting seafood to the U.S. to protect marine animals to those comparable to the U.S. So basically saying like, you have to kind of do what we do or you can't import our stuff. And the idea was that they were trying to get other countries to strengthen their policies instead of weakening our own. So instead of saying, okay, never mind, we won't label, they were saying like, we're not even going to buy your stuff if you don't do it. And somehow that was okay. I don't really understand the like legal logistics, but it was. So there's lots of other forms of bycatch that we see, right? Sharks, rays, marlins, sea turtles, lots of stuff. And what's kind of interesting, the dolphins have taken a front seat, but technology used to catch tuna that's dolphin safe isn't always safe for other species. So it's kind of a bigger problem than just dolphins. And again, we mean well, right? But we got to figure that out. Now, the other thing to think about is that the oceans and the fisheries are commons, right? No nation lays claim to those open oceans. No one owns it. Everybody can use it, which means we know from commons it is susceptible to overuse and degradation. And if we look at our fish species worldwide, many are at the point of not doing great. 62% of the world's fish stocks are in need of management action, which means that they're to a point where they could become depleted very soon. Watch that in class. We're not going to watch it now. I can't skip. Hold on. I'm trying. Oh, dear goodness. All right. There we go. All right. So along with this, right, with the oceans being commons, we have all other kinds of issues. I'm going to kind of skip through a lot of this. So what do we do? First of all, people have to be aware of kind of all those externalities, right? All those things that happen because of their actions. So there's a couple things we can do. One, we can privatize the commons. Tricky to do with the oceans, but we've kind of extended country ownership out. I forget exactly how many nautical miles it is, but we own a little bit more. We can regulate things with the government. So we have permit systems to restrict use. So if you've ever watched like Deadliest Catch, you know that there's a quota system, right? And you can catch a certain amount of the quota and kind of get paid for that, but you can't catch over that. And they determine that quota by looking at the biomass and kind of how healthy that stock is, and they adjust as needed. They also limit what you can catch, right? So if you've ever even done personal fishing, you know if you catch stripers, you can only keep them if they're a certain size, and you know for some things you can't keep females and things like that. And then there's also self-regulation, which works kind of. So after the collapse, if you didn't know, in the 90s, we had a really massive cod pollock fishery collapse over here in the Atlantic. And especially areas like fishing communities north of Boston, they really like saw a hit in their economy. I should say south of Boston too. It's that whole coast, right? So a fishery collapse is defined as 90% decline in fish population. So after the 90s, the government kind of stepped in and said, we got to figure this out. So in 96, they passed the Sustainable Fisheries Act, which kind of shifts from economic to conservation. That's the idea of quotas. So we're going to harvest sustainably. We're not going to take too much. We're going to protect the habitat that's there. There have also been a ton. I'm not going to go through all of these laws. You should at some point, but we know of the Endangered Species Act already. CITES is another big one, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So they internationally make sure that threatened or endangered species cannot be sold. Again, there's black markets and things, but they work on kind of protecting things that are there. You've got the Law of the Seas, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Whale Conservation. Again, I can keep going. Magnuson's actually a pretty big one. That was the one that set the regional fishery quotas, size limits, and kind of started to try to minimize bycatch. That was really important. Quotas again, you got all this. Now, the other side of it is we're starting to see that global fish production is kind of maxed out. So we're starting to look into aquaculture or fish farming. So the idea is it's basically farming fish in the ocean. They kind of are offshore in these little pods. So it's in the ocean environment, but they're separated by a barrier. Now, some negatives to this, right? We do get fish. It's great. But a couple things. First of all, we usually treat kind of like we do even with like CIFOs, lots of antibiotics to keep that fish population healthy. Those are in the water. Water moves, right? We have the risk of either eggs or stock even getting out and non-native species escaping. We also see like high disease and parasites. And think about it, when they poop, it all goes straight down. Like they're sitting there, it poops. We get this like big kind of fish sewage spots underneath them. But again, we get fish. They're working on some alternatives. One of them, fish ponds, happen inland, so we don't have to worry about like contaminating the oceans. But they do take up land space, so we have to kind of balance that. And we also are starting to see these kind of like floating fish pods kind of come about. It's the same idea as the fish farm in the ocean, except they move. It solves some of the problems, like, the antibiotic kind of concentration and the nitrogen concentration from sewage. Gives it a little bit more like natural ocean, right? Where you have water movement and that kind of thing. So you don't need some of those antibiotics. But again, drawbacks to that too. We'll watch that later. All right. So it's doing it again. That's all I got for you on fishing. Sorry, I started talking really fast at the end there. We'll talk more in class if you need it, but happy fish learning. Bye, guys.